Today we're continuing our series in the letters from the book of Revelation. We are in chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, and this is the letter to the church at Smyrna. And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, the words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. I know your tribulation and your poverty, but you are rich, and the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison, that you may be tested, and for 10 days you will have tribulation. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. What does it take for someone to be faithful to Jesus, even if it costs them everything? That's not just a question for one moment in history. Christians in every generation have faced that question, sometimes with their lives on the line. And even for us, it's the kind of question we think about from time to time. If it really came down to it, if following Jesus meant losing everything, what would I do? Maybe even more importantly, we should be asking, what would I need to actually remain faithful? Right? Because it's one thing to say, like, I would stand firm, and it's another thing to actually do it when the pressure is real. Now, that's the situation facing the church in Smyrna. But before Jesus tells them what is coming to the church in this letter, he tells them who he is. Jesus begins with identity, not with instructions or explanations, but with himself. Because everything Jesus is about to say in this letter will only make sense in light of who he is. And so Jesus is introduced here with two references that we saw in John's epic vision in Revelation chapter 1. The words of the first and the last, who died and came to life. Let's look at the first of those references. Jesus is identified as the first and the last. This is not just poetic language. This is a direct claim to deity. This is the language used of God himself in the Old Testament. The first and the last is the one who stands outside of time, the one who rules over all of history. Before him, nothing exists. After him, nothing remains. And now here, Jesus takes that language for himself. It's as if he is saying, nothing comes before me, nothing comes after me. Which means that everything in between, including what this church is about to face, falls under his authority, his rule. Now, the second reference here is Jesus says, I am the one who died and came to life. Jesus entered the very thing that defines human limitation, physical death. And he has come through it. His death on the cross was real, but it was not the end. Jesus lives. And because he now lives, those who belong to him will also live. That is the great promise of the gospel. Which means that there is nothing final about anything this church is about to face. Jesus is Lord over life and death. He rules over from the beginning to the end. So Jesus is anchoring them here in who he is before he starts talking about their situation. And he does this because what is going to sustain faithfulness? It's not going to be found in circumstances and pleasant and comfortable circumstances. It's going to be found in Jesus and in who he is. So the letter begins with these words: I know your tribulation. Jesus knows their tribulation, not in a general sense, but personally, specifically. And he knows what they are facing because, as we've talked in the last couple weeks, he walks among them. He is present with them. And the word that is used here, tribulation, is actually a very vivid one. In the ancient world, it could be used to describe a form of torture where someone would be laid on their back and then a weight, like a plate or something, would be placed on their chest. And then another, until the pressure just became unbearable and crushed them. That's the picture here. Not one sudden blow to the church in Smyrna, but a pressure that builds and weight that accumulates. That's what's happening here. It's not just one hardship the church is going through. It's layer upon layer of pressure, pressing down on them, increasing the weight, tightening the strain. And with each layer, the question becomes more and more urgent. What does it take to remain faithful to Jesus when the pressure doesn't let up? So there are 3 plates that we are going to be looking at. The first plate is the pressure that comes in the form of poverty. We read in verse 9, I know your tribulation and your poverty. Now, in a city like Smyrna, that carried some real weight because Smyrna was not a struggling city. It was a very prosperous port city. Lots of money could be made in Smyrna. It was influential and loyal to Rome, and there were all kinds of goodies attached to Smyrna. So the opportunity was there if you were willing to participate in the life of the city. But that was the problem. Economic life in Smyrna often revolved around trade guilds, and those guilds were closely tied to pagan worship. To belong meant the Christians would need to compromise, but to refuse would mean exclusion. And that's what they did. The Christians found themselves pushed out. So they are not poor by accident or because they live in an impoverished area. They are poor because they are faithful to Jesus. Now it is into this reality that Jesus says something that would have sounded almost unbelievable. In verse 9 he says, but you are rich. You are rich. See, Jesus is not ignoring their situation. He is redefining it. From the world's perspective, the Christians in Smyrna have very little, limited income, limited influence. But from heaven's perspective, they have everything. They belong to God. They are known by him. He is for them, not against them. Their sins have been forgiven. They have the peace of God. They live in the joy of God, and their future is secure. Nothing that truly matters is missing. Nothing that defines them can ever be taken away from them. So, even if their earthly resources are limited, even if their opportunities are few in this world, they're not poor. They're rich. Because everything that this world is chasing after, security, identity, a long-lasting life, it's already theirs in abundance through Christ. And so there's a word here for us today, right? Because we live in a culture that is constantly telling us, you need more, you need better, you need to build something up for yourself. And it's easy as Christians, even as Christians, to start measuring life that way with, things like security and status and success. But Jesus says, if you have me, you already have the most important thing. You already have what matters the most. And so for us, faithfulness looks like not building your identity on what you own and not overvaluing it. Not compromising just to get ahead. And not chasing status to prove your worth. Because you are anchored somewhere else. You are anchored in someone else. Right? And I would say that we see this so beautifully in the global church. There are believers, millions, who have very, very little material in terms of material possessions, whether it's clothes or food for today or any kind of shelter or clothing. They have nothing. And yet there is deep joy and contentment that from a worldly perspective is impossible to explain. How can they be like that? Well, because they truly believe that they are rich in the things that really matter. Well, the pressure on the church in Smyrna doesn't just stay in the realm of finances. Again, it builds. Jesus says he knows their poverty, but also the slander of those who say they are Jews and not. So the second plate is reputation. The reputation is being attacked. False things are being said about them. Things that make them look dangerous, untrustworthy, even a threat to society. So, their name is being dragged through the mud as Christians. And into that, what does Jesus say? I know. I know what is being said and that it's not true. But he doesn't stop there. He shows them the source of the slander. He says it comes from a synagogue of Satan. So this is not just a theological disagreement. This is more than just a misunderstanding. There is a deeper reality behind this. There is an enemy at work here through lies, through distortion, through accusation. What they are experiencing is a targeted opposition from Satan himself, which sounds very overwhelming to be targeted directly by Satan. And this is where who Jesus is really matters, really knowing that. Again, that he is the one, he's the first and the last. He's the one who died and came back to life. And so that tells us that he is far greater than the one who opposes them, the church in Smyrna. Jesus is far greater than any opposition, and it is his word, not the accusations thrown against them, that define what is true. And again, I think there's something in here that speaks to us, because that same enemy is at work today against the church. Now, maybe not in the same way, but it's the same pattern, where what you believe or how you live, it's misunderstood. When standing for what is true is seen as harmful and hateful. When conviction is labeled as intolerance. Or when people hear you're a Christian, they decide what they think about you before you've even met them or ever said a word. right? We live in that kind of context today. And so let me encourage you, especially here. Jesus knows. Jesus knows what is said about his people, and he knows what is not true. And that has, I think, just a very freeing aspect to it for us, because we don't have to worry about controlling how we are seen or perceived by the world. We don't need to guard our reputation. We don't have to win out on every misunderstanding. We don't have to try to correct every false assumption. All right? We are just called to be faithful. Faithful to Jesus, whether the world understands us or not. We are to be faithful to Jesus. And if the pressure of loss, financial loss and accusation were not enough, there is still another layer to come, the third and heaviest plate of all. In verse 10, Jesus says, "Do not fear what you are about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison." Suffering is coming. Physical suffering. Imprisonment. Jesus doesn't soften it in any way. And then he says, "Be faithful unto death." Is this not where the pressure reaches its full weight in the call to martyrdom? Yet Jesus commands, be faithful. Not until it gets hard, not until it costs something, not until it becomes inconvenient. Be faithful unto death. And this is not theoretical. There was now a well-known man named Polycarp. He was a leader in the church. He was the bishop of Smyrna. And he was arrested and for being a Christian and for not participating in the worship of the emperor. And he was given a choice. He could deny Christ, acknowledge the emperor and live, or he could remain faithful to Jesus and die a very painful death. And he said, 86 years I have served him. How can I now deny him? And with that, Polycarp was killed. He was martyred, just as Jesus had said the church would be facing. And so the question that comes to us, and it's a heavy question, is what is God doing in a moment like that? When the pressure is that great and the cost is that high, like what's actually happening? And this is where the text helps us. It says, Jesus says that you may be tested. And tested means that what they're going to face isn't going to be random. It's not going to be accidental. Rather, the pressure they will undergo has a purpose. The pressure has a purpose. And the purpose is not to destroy their faith, but to reveal it. To show that what they have in Christ is real. To prove both to them and to the watching world that Jesus is worth more than earthly comfort and convenience. He's worth more than security. He's worth more than life itself. And this is not unique to Smyrna. This is how God has always worked with his people. He allows pressure. Here we see it's limited for 10 days. He knows its boundaries. But he allows it not because he's abandoning the church, but because he's refining them. He is strengthening them. He is making their faith visible. Because a faith that costs nothing proves nothing. But a faith that endures under pressure reveals what it is truly resting upon. And beyond that, God is going to use this this pressure and their faithfulness to display his glory, to advance his gospel. When so often persecution gave rise to the rapid spread of the gospel. And God is using it to show the world that Christ is worth everything. Yes, the suffering that was about to come is real, but it would not be wasted. And let's take that to heart, because when pressure comes into our life, difficulty and suffering, maybe not in the same way as it did in Smyrna, but it comes, we are to remember we are not being overlooked. We are not being forgotten. Whatever is going is not outside of the Lord's control, because the same God who is at work in Smyrna, revealing and refining, is at work in us today. He's at work in you and your circumstances right now as well. Well, Jesus does not end the letter with a command. He ends with a promise. Before we look at what Jesus promises, it's worth noting something about this letter. Unlike most of the other letters, Jesus in no way corrects this church. There's no rebuke, there's no warning, there's no calling to repent, only encouragement. And even at the end, there is no contrast between a positive and a negative outcome like we'll see in the other letters. Only a promise, which tells you something. This church is not drifting. This is a church that is suffering. And what they need is not correction. What they need is the strength to endure. And that's exactly what Jesus gives them. Not by removing the pressure, but by setting their eyes on what is coming. See, he doesn't just call them to faithfulness. He tells them what awaits them on the other side of faithfulness. In verse 10, Jesus says, I will give you the crown of life. In Smyrna, crowns were a very well-known and common symbol of honor. It was a sign of victory, and it was a visible form of recognition, of greatness. And it was given to crowns were made of laurel, were given to athletes, conquering generals, or gladiators who had done great feats in the arena. Those are the people who wore crowns in Smyrna, but not the Christians. There weren't any Christians wearing crowns in Smyrna. Again, they were marginalized, they're spoken against, slandered, pushed aside, persecuted. And into that, Jesus says to them, you will be honored above all. You will be given a crown by the one who has overcome all things. And it'll be a crown that does not fade. A life that cannot be taken away. And to strengthen their faith, he adds a second promise. In verse 11, he who conquers will not be hurt by the second death. The second death, which is later revealed in Revelation, is final judgment. This is eternal separation from God. It is the ultimate loss. It is all eternity in the lake of fire. And Jesus says, as you remain faithful, that will not touch you. It will not brush against you. It will not come near you, this second death. You may be pressed in this life, and you may lose much, even your life, or the first death. But the final judgment, that ultimate separation, is not yours. Why? Because you belong to him, and what he gives you outlasts everything you might lose. So, let's go back to our original question. What does it take to remain faithful to Christ when the cost is real? I believe it comes down to this: what you believe about Jesus and what you believe because of him. what you believe about Jesus and what you believe because of him. Because if Jesus is truly the first and the last, and if he truly has overcome the grave, and if what he promises is lasting and secure, then faithfulness is never a risk. It is the only response that makes sense. And that brings us to the here and now. Because we are not facing the same sort of things that they faced in Smyrna, but we are still deciding what Christ is worth. We're still deciding that in our lives, not necessarily in a moment of crisis, but in our everyday choices. What is Jesus worth? When it costs you something, when it would be easier to stay quiet, when compromise feels small and justified. You see, that is where faithfulness lives. So let's not just ask the question, if I were in Smyrna and my life was on the line, would I have been faithful then? Ask, am I being faithful now? Because Christ is not only worthy of your death, he is worthy of your life.